Hi, my dear friends. Today I have a privilege to host a special guest, Professor Andreas Omland, who is serving as a political scientist studying contemporary Russian and Ukrainian history, as well as regime transitions. Currently, Andreas Omland is an analyst at a Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Please do not forget to subscribe to my channel. This channel is a smart solutions community. We are here finding smart solutions for every and each one. Please leave a comment and we are starting. Andreas, welcome to Smart Solutions Community channel.
Thank you, Pina. Thanks for having me.
Dear Andreas, may I call you this way? What is your assessment of Ukraine's performance in terms of adjustment to the European Union political and legal standards? Do you foresee that in the fall of this year, the official accession talks with European Union Commission will be resumed?
Yes, that is a good question, and is a very hot question for Ukraine, because Ukraine has the aim of entering the European Union as a full member already as a state, an official state aim since 1998. It's now also in the legislation and constitution. So it's very important for Ukraine, and last year Ukraine finally got the status as a candidate country for the European Union, which means that it is now already on a track to actually at one point enter the European Union. And this autumn, the decision will be made whether the negotiations directly leading to the accession of Ukraine to the European Union will start. One has to say, though, that the experience from East Central Europe was that these negotiations can last several years, and that this is not yet a sign that Ukraine will soon enter the European Union as a full member. But the start of these negotiations basically means that there's only a question left when, and not any longer whether Ukraine will enter the European Union. So therefore this is a very important question. And currently, the situation is such that the European Union has last year formulated 7 conditions for Ukraine to start to fulfill in order to start the accession negotiations. And Ukraine is still trying to fulfill them in time for October. October is the usual time, the usual month for the report that the European Union makes for the accession countries, for the candidate countries. And so Ukraine has now a deadline, actually, to fulfill these conditions. They concern the fight against corruption, minority rights, the rule of law. And so Ukraine still has to work hard on this. So I'm not entirely sure. I think the chances are more than 50% that Ukraine actually will fulfill the conditions and will start the accession negotiations by the end of this year. But I'm not yet 100% sure that actually everything will be done by October, and that Ukraine indeed will then go into the last so to say procedure before entering the European Union.
It means that we should be realistic that Ukraine will not join NATO in short term, perspective, not join in near time. If even war ends, it will take more time to be about NATO.
Well, NATO is another question. NATO is a much more political question. Ukraine could theoretically already today enter NATO. NATO is a very different organization, and here the question is less about legislation and about state administration and civil society and minority rights and fight against corruption, all of these public policy issues that Ukraine still has, and which are the reason why Ukraine is not yet a member of the European Union. With NATO, it's much more about the political, or one could even say geopolitical situation. And I'm afraid that Ukraine may only enter NATO when it may not need NATO anymore that much. So that is the paradox here. NATO, you can imagine as an insurance company, and now for Ukraine, the sad situation is that the insurance case has already happened. And so my presentiment is that Ukraine will not enter NATO before the conflict with Russia will not be solved in one way or another. And then Ukraine will enter NATO, but then it will be a situation when actually Ukraine may not need NATO that much anymore.
Yeah, I'm agree with you that that is European Union, that is another association, and NATO is a separate association, and not NATO is more. There is more chances that Ukraine will be in NATO as soon as war ends. Yeah. Not
yes.
Before war ends.
Yeah, I'm afraid it will be. It will actually need the war to end, that Ukraine will enter NATO, because the problem here is that all the currently 31 members of NATO, probably soon 32 members of NATO, Sweden will probably also enter soon NATO. I'm now speaking from Stockholm in Sweden. All of them have to agree. It has to be a consensual decision, and even a country like Sweden has had problems entering NATO. As you may know, Turkey and Hungary have both not yet fully ratified the accession of Sweden to NATO, and so Ukraine will also have these problems, or different or similar problems with entering NATO. With the European Union, I think in a way it's more complicated but also easier, because the European Union is a very complicated organism. It means actually very close integration, unlike NATO, where the countries basically, stay by their own. They are just in an alliance within NATO. But with the European Union, Ukraine would be entering actually a very sort of integrated organism. And that's why it takes so long also to enter the European Union, why the accession process and the adaptation of the legislation takes quite a long time. But with the European Union, once Ukraine has all its negotiation chapters closed, all its legislation adapted to the European Union, then I think Ukraine will enter the Union, I think without that much depending on what Russia thinks. So the European Union is in a way easier for Ukraine to enter, because it's more a public policy issue, which Ukraine has much more control of. Concerning NATO, Ukraine cannot really control its accession. It can only knock at the door of NATO, and then hope that perhaps one day the door will open. With the accession to the European Union, it's more a technical issue. Also, the European Union is not a defense community to the same degree as NATO. It is also a defense union, but the profile of the European Union is not so much in the military, but more in economics.
We recently listened and recently see news that there is chance that Ukraine can get members in NATO by compromising its territorial integrity. Does this point of view prevail among Western political allies?
Well, unfortunately, there is among Western and non-Western analysts a widespread view that Ukraine could somehow trade some of its territory for getting peace or for getting into NATO. I think that is a very dangerous idea, because that would mean that Russia gets a gratification, a prize, so to say, for its aggression against against Ukraine. So that would mean that a military aggressor can expand its territory at the expense of a victim of an aggression, which is now already happening with the invasion of Ukraine since 2014. But if you have a deal like that, that either NATO membership is exchanged for land or peace is exchanged for land, that would actually mean that other countries would also be involved in such a gratification of an aggressor state. And that would be very dangerous for the whole international order, not just for the liberal international order, but for any order, because that would be then suggestive to other countries, which would then perhaps have also the idea, why don't I do an aggression with a neighboring country, and then I enter some sort of negotiations, and at the end of the day, I will come out of this whole thing with more territory for my country. Yeah, so that could be then very suggestive to other countries, and it could be also, of course, very suggestive to other potential victims of foreign aggression, which may think that they don't want to be as stupid as the Ukrainians, and they may instead, unlike the Ukrainians, for instance, obtain nuclear weapons to protect themselves, not to extend their territory necessarily, but rather to protect their territory, to keep their territory. So these are all very dangerous ideas, I think, and people who make them in public, they don't seemingly understand the implications that something like that would have for the international order.
How do you assess the progress which Ukraine has achieved under President Zelensky, Ellen?
Well, Ukraine has basically, under Zelensky, although Zelensky has won an electoral campaign against Poroshenko, he has basically continued Poroshenko's earlier line. Poroshenko was the first elected president after the Euromaidan revolution, the so-called Revolution of Dignity of 2014. So Zelensky has continued largely these reforms, for instance, decentralization. And then in 2022, the war started. And then, of course, everything changed. And now Zelensky is mainly a wartime president. And as a wartime president, he has been surprisingly successful, surprisingly because his preparation for this role was null. It was non-existent. Basically, he was an actor, a comedian, and people were very skeptical what kind of president he would be in wartime. But it turned out that actually Zelensky has grown a lot during the last 2 years, and that he has turned out to be actually a good choice for Ukraine during the wartime. He's a good speaker, he's a good communicator, and Ukraine has performed much better in this war than many have expected. Many people have expected last year that Ukraine would be quickly defeated by Russia, but that has not happened. Now Ukraine is in a counteroffensive and is hoping to restore fully its territorial integrity. So, yeah, I think he's altogether a successful president. Although I wonder how much perhaps other presidents would have been perhaps also successful, like Poroshenko or Tymoshenko, who were the main other candidates in 2019 and the last presidential elections. They may have also performed well in this situation, but in any way, we only have the Zelensky performance, the Zelensky case, and Zelensky is generally acknowledged not only in Ukraine but also outside Ukraine as having been a good choice for this difficult period in Ukraine's history.
Do you foresee the possibility of the political collapse in Russia? Are members of Russian elite afraid to become scapegoats for a meaningless war against Ukraine?
A collapse, at least of the regime and perhaps even of the state of Russia, is possible, I think, as the result of this war. It would not be the first time. As a result of World War I, the Tsarist Empire collapsed. As a result of a lost Cold War, the Soviet Empire collapsed, and it may now happen that as a result of a lost war against Ukraine, also the Russian Federation, which sees itself today also as an empire, may also collapse. At least I think the regime will collapse at some point. I think whenever Putin leaves, for whatever reasons, for health reasons or political reasons, or because he dies or whatever else may happen, I think the regime will not survive that. I think the regime cannot easily reproduce itself. The problem is not that there is no successor to Putin. The problem is rather that there are too many successors of Putin, or too many people in Moscow who see themselves as successors, and they will have to find a compromise between each other, these clans in Moscow, and that will be very difficult for them to find this compromise, because if you are not on the top in the Russian system, political system, you are in danger. If you are only playing a secondary role, then this is dangerous. If your clan is not in power, then this is not good for you, and that's why I think the departure of Putin will also mean the end of the regime, and it could even lead to the collapse of the state. Maybe not the collapse of the Russian Federation, that it will totally disappear, but that some parts of the Russian Federation will depart. Not only those that Russia has now occupied in Ukraine, but also, for instance, in the Northern Caucasus, perhaps other parts of the Russian Federation could also try to escape the Federation in an economic crisis, for instance, and that could in turn lead even to something like civil war within Russia. Even that cannot be excluded today.
Why did Western world fail to bind Russia in 1990 and secure there the sustainable democratic development? Russia was heavily dependent upon Western aid, so it seems that it was impossible to impose more control on Russia and secure the smooth functioning of free market economy, supervised by a democracy elected government.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big discussion about possible mistakes that the West has made in the 1990s. I also think that the West has not paid enough attention to Russia in the 1990s. But to assign most of the responsibility for what has happened then after the 1990s to the West is, I think, too easy. Because the West has tried to help Russia. So, for instance, the West has included Russia in the Council of Europe. It has transformed the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe into the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It has expanded the G7 group into the G8 group. So for many years, Russia was part of the G8 group, of a very prestigious and powerful community, exclusive also community, although arguably it was unjustifiedly a member of this G7 club or G8 club, because it was neither politically nor economically really comparable to the other 7 countries in this club. There was the NATO-Russia Council, a special institution that NATO created in connection with the enlargement of NATO, and there was a cooperation agreement with the European Union that was supposed to be developed into something like an association agreement of the European Union. So the West has tried to incorporate, to bind, to support Russia's democratic development, but obviously not enough. And then Putin came to power, and then basically the chance was gone, and Putin is now attempting basically a restoration of the Tsarist/Soviet empire, a mixture of both of them, and is basically returning into the 19th century, you could argue, into a time that seems to have gone already for many years. The other empires, the British Empire, the Austrian Empire, Ottoman Empire, they have all disappeared, and we still have the Russian Empire, oddly enough. So this is a strange situation, and it was perhaps something that Russia is itself responsible for, And the West has tried, not enough, I would say, but also Russia has not tried enough to become integrated with the West. So Russia, there have been, for instance, signals both from Yeltsin and even from Putin about Russia becoming a member of NATO, but there has never been an application actually of Russia for NATO membership. Yeah, so and that is something that the Russian leadership could never imagine itself to apply just for NATO membership. They always wanted some sort of new NATO or a new organization, and they saw themselves as a great power. And but that is not something that applies to an organization like NATO. NATO doesn't distinguish between great powers and small powers. You have to apply actually as every ordinary country, and then you can become a member of NATO. Russia has never done that, and therefore, I think this sort of discussion about the Western responsibility for the failure of Russian democratization is, I think, sometimes overdrawn. I think it's rather a domestic development, which perhaps the West could have prevented. That is very difficult to say, but it was something that had powerful domestic determinants, and we don't know what could have happened in an alternative history.
After outbreak of the full-scale Russian invasion into Ukraine, Western states have imposed many restrictions upon Russian oligarchs. Do you find such measures effective?
Well, the oligarchs are actually a hotly discussed issue. How much and which oligarchs should be sanctioned? How much the oligarchs should be sanctioned? Because some of them are less involved in the Russian war effort. Others are more involved and are supporting the war. Others have sort of made signals that they are against the war. And there have been Russian opposition politicians who have suggested that actually the West should differentiate between different oligarchs in order to promote a split of the regime and to promote a sort of an alternative for Putin, an attempt from an internal opposition to depose Putin, something like that. These are all very difficult questions, and I'm not sure where I'm standing myself on all of this. The problem here is really, I would say, a normative, a moral problem that if you are part of the Russian economy as a Russian oligarchs, you are basically also part of the war because you're paying taxes, you're producing something, probably something of what you're producing, of what you're doing is at least indirectly used in the war. And then it becomes very difficult for a sanctions regime to make exceptions for certain oligarchs. So that's a difficult issue. Although I also see the logic behind what some people say, that not all oligarchs are the same, and that we should try to sort of be less restrictive towards those oligarchs who have shown at least some resistance against the war. I'm not sure that this strategy can work, but I see the logic behind it. So I'm sort of agnostic about it.
Yeah, and if can you share your view and oversight about India and Ukraine relationship?
I think India and Ukraine have an underdeveloped relationship, which should be much closer. I believe there's a whole range of, I would think, issues where the two countries could find a common language. One of them, for instance, being that India and Ukraine are both democracies and they have meaningful elections, unlike, let's say, Russia and China, which also have procedures that are called elections, but they don't have, as everybody knows, they don't have much of an of meaning in these countries. So that is one of the big connecting things. And also, I think geopolitically, what we will see here is perhaps over the long run, a confrontation in the 21st century between democracies and autocracies. And then both countries would be, by their domestic political orders, in the democratic camp. And moreover, as we have now this informal alliance between Russia and China, there's also the competition, let's put it that way, between India and China, and the confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, which should also be something that can bring these two countries together. And so I'm actually dismayed by the underdevelopment of the Indian-Ukrainian relations. And if this confrontation between a sort of Russia-China camp on the one side and Europe on the other side continues, then I think there will be more and more reasons for closer relations between India and Europe. And I would say India and Europe, including Ukraine. Yeah, so this is something that then sort of would crystallize for me. But I also have to admit, I've never been, unfortunately, to India, so I'm not so familiar with Indian domestic affairs. One of the misunderstandings that I've heard of is that much of the sort of Indian sympathy for the former Soviet Union is now sort of transferred to Russia, and forgetting that Ukraine was also part of the former Soviet Union, and that Ukraine was also an important part of the former Soviet Union. So that is also something that perhaps could be corrected and could be a basis for better relations in the future between India and Ukraine.
Yeah, first of all, and yes, welcome to India. Anytime, whenever you plan, I'm also living here in Ukraine, but in India also often visit before war and post-COVID. But it doesn't matter that you are not living in India or you are not visiting so many, often India. You are aware about what is going on. That India is continue transaction with Russia on less value of oil. Yeah, that is already for Russia. This is a heartening. Yeah, heart, because this is a anyway sanction there is a apply. So even less value, this is also lost for Russia. So anyway, India even tried to make cheaper Russia value oil, gas, and chemicals. This also affecting on their transaction, right, and relationship, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously India has other interests, and it's far away geographically from this conflict and has its own priorities, above all economic priorities. So I can, I understand this at the current situation, but I think for the future, as we may be seeing now a new Cold War emerging between democracy and autocracy, I think the Indian position, as I see it, should be in the democratic camp, and especially since India and China have tense relations, as far as I know, anyway. So I think that could then be also something where Ukraine, on the basis of which Ukraine and India could develop in the future closer relations.
Thank you very much, dear Andreas, for an interesting discussion. And thank you, friends, for being with us. Follow our next show on Smart Solutions Community, our channel. Thank you.